uppercut, try to hit me in the gut, thinking that I won't react. You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You hit a bus. Oh, 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 oh. You hit a bus. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home. Begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. You're crying age, you're in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You hit a bus. Oh, 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 oh. You hit a bus. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round.
Photo of you in my mind, on the table under lights. There's no one here but you and I. This neon town is yours and mine. And I said, hey, 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐿. Stayed up through the days and night, late and we watched the world get light. Hey, 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐿.
That should do it. Like, yep, that should do it. There you go. Sorry about that. Thank you. Yeah, Titan. I'm aware. Thank you. So I think we fixed Nightbot. I don't recall that we haven't heard from Nightbot. Nightbot has very, very, very limited privileges. So first of all, I just want to get a sound check and make sure you guys can hear me. Yep, this says you can. So we're good. We'll get that. So it's always something. I don't know what Nightbot's doing. So I know also Pat wanted to come in, so hopefully he'll be joining us. I did want to just clarify one thing, just because, and I almost clarified it at the end of the show, but I decided not to. I wanted to get going on to this one. But I had said, I think just a few minutes before Pat showed up, I don't know if he was there listening or not, but one of the things I had said was, look, we've done too many shows where World War III has been trending, and this isn't the first time we've done that. And for people who are freaked out about World War III, you shouldn't be freaked out about that right now. There's a bar at which, that's something that you should really be concerned about. If you're not worried about what's happening in Ukraine, then you haven't been paying attention. I'm worried. I think people should genuinely be worried. This is a very serious problem, and it's a global problem. I don't think it's to the point where people should be panicking over. I don't think we're World War III does not need to be a trending hashtag. But that was, and it seems to me that that's what you were bouncing off of. Is that roughly accurate, or am I putting words? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I was wondering if that's.
Yeah.
And I'm going to get the link. Let me go. Does that sound about?
That is, and I was, my brain was moving a little faster than my mouth was too. I didn't get all the words out that I wanted to say, because I was specifically referencing many of the prepper groups that I watch, where everybody's freaking out.
Yes.
They're like, oh, this is going to be the collapse of the U.S. And I'm not talking about, if you're over there in Central Europe, you have a hell of a lot to be concerned about. You've got a nuclear armed nation that's invading other countries right in your backyard. You should be concerned about that. In the United States, that's, where nobody's going to be, launching missiles into your residential neighborhood. So, perhaps maybe tone down the doomsday rhetoric a little bit in the United States.
Yeah, I got a little worried when people in the U.S. are that worried about it. I think we should be worried. If you're not, like I said, then you're not paying attention. But I don't think we need to be sitting there saying it's World War III yet. Just trying to be trying to tamp down fears without saying that while admitting that I'm worried about it too. I'm genuine. I'm not worried about World War III just yet, but this is a concerning situation, and if you're not concerned, you're not paying attention. So Pat is here, and then before we introduce Pat, the call-in line is open. That's 484-2 in time. That's 484. 246-8463. You can call in. You can join. The link is in the bottom. It's just live.intimeshow.com. Come on in and join us. Pat, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing good, thank you. Doing very good. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm disappointed. We were muted for the first, 30 seconds, and the only one who bothered to say anything was Titan. And I'm not sure I think it was a professional courtesy. I don't think it was because he wanted to listen to the show. It's just like, just pointing out, Nick, that nobody else seemed to care that you were muted. I was like, oh, fuck. Oh. So,
why is full disclosure? I said, why is Nick muted?
Okay, well,
why can't I hear Nick?
Exactly. Why can't I hear? Yeah, exactly. Well, so good. So, yeah, these interfaces all need to. I've been overhauling just the in-time interface, and I'm going to copy them all over, and it's almost ready for that move. But it's a pain in the neck, and been a little busy. So, all right. So now you had mentioned. So you've been talking to people in Ukraine. Is that right? If I just realized I probably should have asked if that was. I could say that, but
right. Both Ukrainian Americans and Ukrainians. Professional contacts that have either fled the country or have previously left Ukraine but still have family there.
And what's the sentiment? I mean, I can probably guess, but
I mean, it's one of sheer panic, and to say abject fear is not even a qualifier. They are those that don't have contact with family are extremely worried about family. Those that do have contact with family are worried that their family won't be able to either receive food and or other basic necessities and or be able to leave the country without military reprisals being placed upon them.
Is there anything that you think, I know there have been a few donation sites coming up. I just got hit with one as we were closing yesterday, but since I can't confirm it, and I always get worried about those kinds of things. I always say donate to Doctors Without Borders, donate to the International Red Cross. Those are, in my view, two safe organizations. Is there anything, if somebody listening to this wants to help, that they can do that you can think of?
So the Red Cross is excellent once people are able to get out of Ukraine. Particularly, the Red Cross is doing good work in regions on the border countries of Ukraine that have been willing to take refugees. I would only advise people that before you donate, you research as much as possible to the organizations that you're giving money to, because there's issues regarding whether or not those organizations are legitimate. But I'd rather see people err on the side of giving rather than not give at all. But ultimately, these issues, the humanitarian issues, are paramount, but they're secondary to the larger, global military issues that need to be addressed, either both in Europe and abroad, in my opinion.
All right. Well, you I think know more about this stuff than I do. Let's start talking about those. So, we've talked before about, are NATO countries going to involve themselves in any way? What would that look like? What do you think? I mean, let's.
So NATO is a secondary issue, and I think people, and all respect to you and your co-host Zandring, you're getting lost on the NATO issue. Mm-hmm. This is a secondary NATO issue. 28 years ago, in 1994, ourselves, Britain, and several other member nations signed a specific agreement with Ukraine. Ukraine in 1994 was the third most powerful nuclear power. America, Russia, Ukraine. Ukraine's independence, Ukraine inherited a vast nuclear arsenal. In 1994, the Budapest Agreement, which is known as the Budapest Memorandum, was a real incentive. And if you look back in time, you and I were both alive at this time, it was hailed as one of the greatest successes of U.S. diplomacy at the time. And what it was an agreement that A, Russia would never invade Ukraine, B, Ukraine would give up its entire nuclear arsenal, which was not, it wasn't like they had a few nukes. They were the third largest nuclear power in the world. And that includes China. So Ukraine gives up its nukes with the understanding that they will, in perpetuity, receive an agreement of which America is a co-signer in this agreement. We urged Ukraine to do this with the understanding that we would back Ukraine independence for an agreement of permanent non-aggression from Russia. Russia will never acknowledge Ukraine's sovereignty and acknowledge their borders, and would never militarily invade the country. Now, for the people that this is kind of new information to, and I'm not faulting anybody, Putin was alive when this agreement was made. He was, him and his party, I can't say him personally, but the hardliners in the Kremlin at the time that were still, post-Soviet era were very upset about this agreement. That they were basically having to agree to give Ukraine independence. Ukraine had been a satellite state for quite a long time. But the Ukrainian people were guaranteed independence in the exchange for the ability to retaliate against Russia if Russia invaded their country, because that was the real issue at the time. We didn't want World War III.
Yeah.
What's happening now is Americans are going NATO, 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 but we signed an agreement. Ourselves, Russia, Ukraine, Great Britain, and I can't remember the other signatories. I'll look it up in a minute. But ultimately, America agreed that any act against Ukraine would be a violation of this agreement, and be commensurate with our military involvement in the region. Arabi was talking about, Zandring made a comment earlier today that Ukraine has no strategic military involvement in the region. It did 28 years ago. 28 years ago, Ukraine was the single most militarily important question that we had. And Americans are myopic in their view. We owe the Ukrainians more than just handshakes and prayers. We owe them significant military and logistical support that, if it includes a limited ingress into Ukraine in order to stabilize the region, we owe them that. Because we agreed, as did Russia, that Ukraine would remain its borders secure and that Russian intervention in the region would never occur. Because if Ukraine still had its nukes, Russia would not be intervening. But we were so afraid of, and when I say we, I'm talking about the United States and other signatories, were so worried about a nuclear-armed Ukraine and potential hostility with Russia's, we asked Ukraine to disarm. They did, and now their people and their populace are paying the price for American superiority, because we believed we had the right to tell Ukraine what they could do, as did other European powers. And now they're being slaughtered wholesale while Americans clutch their pearls and talk about how we can't afford to be involved in the region because it may spark off World War III. In 1994, we were worried about making it to 1995. And now, 27 years later, we're going, well, we don't want to be involved because that's a Russia issue. And all we're really doing is not agree. NATO is ultimately bullshit if we don't honor the Budapest Agreement. And that's just where I'll leave it.
All right, a couple of things. First of all, I sincerely appreciate you blaming Zandring for that. That's sort of, we have like an order of blame, and Zandring should always come first on those. I was actually the one who said that. And I was quoting Professor John J. Mearsheimer and a speech that he gave recently at the University of Chicago, and why he said that, in fact, we should not be messing with Ukraine at all and we should cede Ukraine to Russia. And I was saying why I thought he was wrong and why that argument did not work. But I was quoting him and I was disagreeing with it. I don't think Zandring ever opined on the strategic importance. That was, again, this professor at the University of Chicago who was making a point that we should just let it go because it's strategically a national interest to them and not to us. And I think he's full of it. So that was the quote, and I don't think Zandring opined past that. I did, but I was quoting someone else and disagreeing with them. I do want to talk about this, though. I haven't heard. Now, I know the deal you're talking about. We've mentioned this, and we haven't focused on it, which I'm regretting we haven't done it. So I'm very glad you're bringing this up. But we have discussed this once or twice in the past. So I'd like to bring up a couple of questions and get your take on this. First of all, why is Zelensky not talking about this, or is he talking about this, but our own propaganda, we're just sort of ignoring it and being like, oh, he's mentioning this, but we're not going to talk about it. Has he been mentioning it? Have we been ignoring it? Have we been ignoring that? That's my first question. And the second one to dovetail into is, why do you think we aren't doing it? Is it just the threat of nuclear war? Or is there another reason?
So, thank you. My question, first of all, my comments, recording, again, not trying to be overly pedantic, but regarding the entire commentary earlier about World War III, we won't do anything because of World War III. That's, again, I think that's the misdirection, the red herring in all this. As far as who signed the Budapest Agreement, there are numerous signatories. This was one of Clinton's big things, and whether or not you like Clinton or not, but China and France were two of the agreeers, as was the UK. And the reason the Ukrainians aren't bringing it up, I think, is because they realize that after Crimea, we're not going to honor it anyway. We are, in many ways, as a country, the worst example of, and actually in many ways, the best example of a fair weather friend. We didn't within the Budapest Agreement. It's not exactly delineated what exactly our military existence would be to all these signatories. Now, remember, this is an agreement that Russia agrees not to invade, and other people agreed to assist Ukraine if Russia does invade. So I know everybody's going back to
including
NATO.
China,
NATO
which I didn't know.
is a non-issue.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
China
so-
is one of the
yeah.
signatories on this agreement, or
Yeah, that I did not
a
know.
party that negotiated in it.
Yeah.
In countries like Belarus declaring war on or engaging in military assistance in Ukraine on behalf of Russia is another violation of this agreement. It's one thing to have Russia, but Belarus, these are another issue because by the Budapest Agreement, Russia has coerced another non-Russian agent to engage in activities with Russia. So this is at the point where we have to decide whether or not we can actually sign a treaty with people and honor it. Like, we're looking at NATO. NATO's a treaty. So was the Budapest Agreement. It was a treaty. If I was a European power who was a non-signatory of the Budapest Agreement but a member of NATO, I would not believe a word that came out of our mouth, because this is only 28 years old. 28 years ago, we agreed that Ukrainian sovereignty was paramount in the region, but Ukraine as a new entity within the Eastern European world, as an entity, deserved independence. And we assigned to it and assured in multiple levels of certitude that we would aid them in any and all ways against Russian intervention or invasion of their country. We've basically proved that our agreements, our treaties, and our promises are useless.
We've already, now this isn't though, and so this isn't, I want to dovetail into where to go from here, but I mean, this isn't, we kind of already have demonstrated that. And so that was one of my objections to what happened in Afghanistan and us pulling out, because a great many people had sacrificed their lives on the promise that we were going to stick around and help them rebuild the country, which we really didn't do. And we have made an argument as to why we actually really could have. I mean, we've stuck around in South Korea. There are plenty of places. We still have a military presence, so we weren't losing any significant military staying there, but we bailed on our promises. I don't think we had a treaty per se, but we certainly made a lot of promises. We did the same thing to the Kurds. We did the same thing to, and then one of the more egregious ones was the treaty with Iran, which we actually did. We violated in any meaningful sense. Now we did so technically, legally, in as much as we just refused to certify because we said, oh, you guys are cheating, but we have to demonstrate that they're cheating, in every organization that looked at it, every independent organization, and our own intelligence said they were not cheating. Trump said, oh, they're cheating, boom, we're out. So yeah. So, and then obviously we're trying to renegotiate that now. It was a good deal for us and for the fair weather friends. As soon as we get a new administration that doesn't like Iran, we just nix that deal. So it seems to me we have two problems. The first is, how do we ensure that any deal is going to last more than 4 to 8 years, depending on the administration? And second of all, what do we do about the fact that so far, especially in recent history, we have been ignoring all of our obligations to countries. I mean, we needed the I want to say Northern Alliance, but it's not. It was the Northern Alliance and the Kurds in Iraq, and they helped us at some serious cost to them. We let them go. Did the same thing in Afghanistan. Every one of the police and military who joined because they said the U.S. is going to help us and they're going to stay here for us and we're going to rebuild this country, they're dead. Their families are dead. The women who said, well, I'm going to run for office, they're dead. And it's entirely our fault, in my view. So we're now facing this. This I almost kind of understand, because at least here it's sort of like, well, we're just being cowards. But back there, we didn't even have a reason for, we're not saying they're going, oh, we're worried about World War III. We just have better shit to do, apparently. So what do you think is causing this trend, and what right here and now do you think we can do about it in this situation?
So, I mean, I don't want to play the whataboutism game, but referring to Afghanistan in the same context, Ukraine, is a bit of a red herring. Our assurances to Afghanistan was after our military invasion and, for all intents and purposes, conquest of the country. We were a single, although there were some joint members, occupying power of the country. Our assurances were to a U.S.-backed government. This is very different. Ukraine was independent from the moment this came up. And I don't want to make it sound like when you conquer a country, you can promise them anything you want, because that's effectively what happened in Afghanistan. And again, what happened there is a tragedy of U.S. policy that we will pay for probably the next 50 to 100 years. What's occurring in Ukraine is something very, very different. This was a multi-party joint agreement with an already established and recognized governmental power. The government of Ukraine was independent in 1993 and 94 when this started. They had already in 92 entered a non-proliferation agreement. We were so worried about a nuclear-armed Ukraine and a nuclear-armed Russia, we chose the lesser of two evils. We allowed Russia to limit its nuclear stockpile, with the understanding Russia's claim is that a nuclear-armed Ukraine, because the countries were belligerents with each other, they did not like each other, that both Belarus, who had a significant nuclear stockpile, and Russia and Ukraine, in fear of retaliation against Russia, would disarm. Both Belarus and Ukraine disarmed. What we've shown is it's better to keep your nuclear weapons, because the Americans, the French, and the Chinese and the British, for this, in this particular example, and the Americans don't honor their agreements. I mean, a nuclear-armed Ukraine. I mean, I have no certitudes, but
this wouldn't happen. No, this wouldn't
Ukraine
happen.
With a nuclear stockpile, this would not have happened.
That's as close to a certitude as you can get. Putin wouldn't have done it, because at this point, Ukraine is going to get wiped off the face of the map, and they would rather. Why not at that point just deploy your arsenal? If you're dead anyway, deploy your arsenal and make sure that they pay for it. There is no way this would have happened if they had retained their nukes. Now, ostensibly, we removed those nukes under this policy, this notion that the more countries that have nukes, the more likelihood somebody was going to use them. So we said, I'm paraphrasing this, and please I want to make sure for our audience to make sure they've got it right. We said, get rid of them, and we will guarantee your security along with all these other countries, but you have to get rid of them. That way the whole world is a safer place. They said, okay, on the condition that you guarantee the security. And at this point, everybody's just like, what paper?
Right. But it's actually, I mean, you're in general strokes, you're right. But the real issue is in 1990, when the collapse of the Soviet Union happened in 1992, the issue was all of the former satellites had nuclear weapons. Well, I mean, everywhere that there had been a formerly Soviet-armed Russia, which then became the Russian Federation, these former satellites had a certain amount of nukes.
Yeah.
The United States was terrified because of belligerent attitudes between the former satellites, who basically hated the former Soviet Union, and then by generational reality, the Russian Federation. They were worried that it would be one of these former Soviet actors, these former Soviet satellites, in the event that a Russian resurgence into these regions would cause a nuclear exchange. So this was to protect our European allies as much as it was to ensure the security of Ukraine against a expansionist Russia, which was always a possibility. Russia agreed. If Ukraine, because they saw them as an existential threat, gave up their nuclear arsenal, as is Belarus and some other countries, then the Russians would, in perpetuity, I don't think people understand what that word means. Perpetuity means forever, would agree to honor the sovereign borders of the country as Ukraine, as it was constituted in 1994. That held up until the Russian invasion of the Crimea. It was the first test of U.S. resolve and other European signers, as well as China, on this. That test proved that we were unwilling to militarily intercede in Ukraine. This has never been about NATO, and I think people are really missing the boat. In 1994. The Ukrainians knew that without some agreement or military option, being nukes, that Russia would eventually egress back into their country. Whether or not they had a crystal ball or just the fact that they had been the subject to Russian suppression for, decades. We agreed that a fearful Russia, a Russia that was fearful of Ukraine, was an existential threat. So a de-armed Ukraine would hopefully stabilize the region. In order to get the Ukrainians to de-arm, we had to agree to militarily back them in the event of Russian aggression in the region, us and other members, England, France, and others. And now what we're showing is that all of these countries, England, France, and all the other signatures, our agreement means nothing. This is not about NATO. This is about European and American in the U.S. not being willing and able to actually do what they say they do. If Ukraine would have kept 10% of the nukes they possessed in 1994, this would not have happened. If they would have retained 5%. But the requirement for Russia to agree to this stipulation in Budapest was 0 nuclear weapons, which made us very happy, by the way, because Clinton was all about nuclear de-escalation. So you got a big player off the board. He walked around patting himself on the back for 2 years after this accord was signed. But what this proves is that A, we don't honor our bets, and B, we back down to Russia every chance we have when it comes to military intervention. The fact that there aren't military troops in the Ukraine under the auspices of honoring the Budapest Agreement with an understanding that we're not going to engage in entering Russian territory shows ominously how impotent and flaccid we actually are as a nuclear power. And the fact that we're letting the Russians in both Crimea and other places ethnically cleanse ethnic Ukrainians, because we know what's happening, and we say that this is a Russian-Ukrainian crisis without looking back 28 years ago. I'm 52 years old. I remember this agreement very well. I was in my mid-20s. This is a fact that Russia has once again proven that time and propaganda wins because Americans are too stupid to read a paper and read a history book. That's it. Nick knows about it. I know about it. Zandering knows about it, right? We're all old enough to remember this, but you play into the Fox News cycle talking about how Russia's the good guy now. Russia agreed. The minute the first Russian tank passed into Crimea, I would say ineffective Obama presidency. Obama is the first domino in the incompetence that has occurred in Crimea, and then following Ukraine as its entirety. Biden will be the next, again, impotent, flaccid president, followed by Trump, preceded by Trump, who has once again failed to live up to the oaths and obligations made by the American state. And that means all of us. We may not agree with the president when he signs an agreement, but this is one of the reasons that Ukraine's disarmament was one of the reasons that it was floated around. Clinton was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize because it was right. You got Belarus, you got Ukraine to get rid of their nukes. We should give you the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, it was so important in 1994. I think Americans, they're myopic, and they forget that right today, Ukrainians are suffering because the past administrations in Ukraine trusted American and other European powers' assurances that if they gave their nuclear arsenal, as well as an agreement from Russia, that they would not have their borders penetrated. This is all of it. This has nothing to do with NATO. This is just, NATO's a red herring to make people forget that at one time, Ukraine was the third most powerful nuclear power in the world. And without that, it's just, I don't know why we keep talking about it.
So let me ask you two questions. I'm sure I don't want to dominate. I want to make sure Zandering gets a chance too. But so the two questions I have to ask. One is just to try to put this in a little bit of context. With Obama, Obviously, with Ukraine, he just let that go. But I've heard it said, and I don't think that the timing is off on this. I may have inverted the timing, but my understanding is that a number of people say that it's actually with that so-called red line with Assad. If you use chemical weapons, we will go in. He did that. We did not go in. And it seems like, and then after that, Putin was just like, well, I can go do anything I want to at this point because the U.S. isn't going to do anything. Why does the U.S. have this problem? Assuming for now that it essentially started with air, because that is kind of a similar. I mean, basically, you're using chemical weapons against a civilian population. We called it out and said, if you do this, we will go in. You do it, and then we're like, well, so. It seems to me that the end of that chain is Americans don't want to be involved. We're war weary. We don't really care what's happening in the rest of the world, and we don't, even to the point of, well, our obligations were made who knows how long ago. It really doesn't affect us anymore. Is there a way this country makes it out of that? Because if we don't change that attitude, it seems to me that that's actually kind of the ball game, because nobody's going to want to work with the U.S. going forward.
Well, so again, this is a little bit of apples and oranges.
Right.
The issue with Assad was an American acknowledgement of what we were perceiving as war crimes in the region, the use of chemical weapons, both by the UN and other member states, as being, particularly against civilians, being considered a war crime. But that's interpretive within the international theater. We had no standing agreement with the country of Syria. We had, this is just, and in many ways, it was Obama grandstanding, right? Using the power of the American presidency to project power. It's different than a formal military agreement like we had with ourselves, Russia, France, England, and the Ukraine, where we all signed off saying, if you invade Ukraine, you're violating this agreement, and we will intercede militarily on Ukraine's behalf. I mean, it's one thing to get upset when you see a friend or neighbor receiving an injustice, which would be the similar thing as Syria. Hey, stop hitting my friend. But it's another thing to say, hey, I'm telling you right now, if you attack my friend, I'm willing to go to war on their behalf.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's a little apples and oranges. Now, did we have a need to intervene in Syria? I think so. I think the use of chemical weapons on civilian populations is something that, if the U.S. stands for what it stands for, we have to make a very sober decision about how far we're going to be involved. The second thing is the U.S. in the last 50 years has become increasingly proficient and used to the use of proxies. We'd rather pay other people to fight our wars. We're more than willing to give you military equipment, training, whatever you need, but we're not going to put boots on the ground. But the Budapest Agreement is very clear. This is about military intervention. And whether or not you want to say, well, it's not as clear, we all know what military intervention means. It means U.S. troops in theater. Very few people that have read the Budapest Agreement will say that it's ambiguous unless you are currently a neocon. Again, the fact that in 1994 more Republicans were for this than against it. Again, there were more Democrats against Clinton than there were Republicans at this time on this particular agreement. Neocons were actually, in some cases, the most right-wing part of the Republican Party were saying, no, we need to keep a nuclear-armed Ukraine so that if we have to have someone attack Russia, they're there, they're able, they're capable. And it was the doves, the very extreme part of the Democratic Party, saying, no, we don't want to give Russia a reason to attack Ukraine because they're a nuclear power. How that shifted in 28 years to where now some members of the Republican Party, ostensibly the right, are talking about the power and the positivity of a nuclear-armed Russia's belligerence into a non-nuclear armed and treaty-affirming Ukraine, just shows me how far our politics has swung in 30 years. I mean, this is, again, if this was 1972, the military, we would be invading Ukraine and then surging into Russia. But It's not 1972. We're not fighting, the Vietnam War. We're not set up against a Cold War against Russia. This is the, if you want to call it Cold War II, and ostensibly America is losing Cold War II. And if you don't see that, you're not actually paying attention for the last 50 years.
Is Andrew, did you have any questions? I mean, I've got a couple other questions, and I also before we do that. So again, the link should be at the bottom. It's live.intimeshow.com. Anybody who wants to join us, it's an open hang, so please come as long as you're civil. We're really willing to discuss just about anything. It is amazing the Putin apologetics that's been going on, and it's from the conservatives has been. There was somebody had done a meme, the better dead than red. The meme, the shirts that used to be in the 80s and 90s, the conservatives or the Republicans were better dead than red, meaning that they'd rather be dead than communist. And now they're like, better to be a Russian than a Democrat. It's like, damn, at least a Democrat's like an American. I'm aware that we've got our differences, but holy shit. All right, so anyone who wants to join the number is at the top of the show. Let me just make sure. So it's 484-2 in time. That's 484-246-8463. It's a free call if you have free local in the U.S. dialing. I should say it's not a toll call is what I'm trying to say. Talk to your don't call in and then get paid if you don't have local dialing or whatever. Hit me for it. It's just not a toll number is all I'm saying. Or live.intimeshow.com. Come on in. We'll let you into the show and continue the conversation. I have a couple more questions I definitely wanted to ask, but as Andrew, I was curious if there was anything you wanted to say, because I've been dominating with Pat here, which is always very interesting to have him on. So any thoughts, as Andrew?
The only thing I would point out is the reason that we're talking about NATO is only because Russia or Putin specifically named NATO as an issue, so that's why NATO is being talked about.
I think it's being talked about,
and I would agree.
Yeah, please, Pat. Sorry.
Well,
please.
That's why Putin's right. Putin's talking about it because it's a red herring. Putin doesn't want to refer back to the Budapest Agreement. Putin doesn't want to acknowledge that Russia signed in perpetuity a non-aggression. I mean, again, it's been a while since I read it, like a couple of weeks. But if I remember correctly, the Budapest Agreement was so specific as to even talk about political and economic coercion, right? This was about like the free and independence of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Now, Belarus is ultimately fallen into extreme pro-Russian sympathies to the point where they're effectively a Russian satellite now. But we need to understand that, like, you can find this document, you can read it online, and once you read it, you realize that Russia promised in not only perpetuity, with specific certitude, that Ukraine would be a free and, as far as they were concerned, unadulterated country, as did France, Britain, and ourselves. And I can't remember who the other member parties are. Now, if I remember correctly, France and China technically signed a separate agreement, but they were amendments or concordances with our agreement. So ultimately, several countries signed these memorandum of understanding, which again are treaties, with all of these member states to get Ukraine to disarm, as in additionally Belarus and Kazakhstan. Now, Putin doesn't have to worry about Belarus anymore, because, frankly, they're part of the Soviet Union. The former Soviet Union now anyway, under the Russian Federation. But those other countries, like if you were a Georgian, if you lived in Kazakhstan, like, you need to worry now, because Russia now has realized this 1994 agreement has zero backbone put to it. So Russia is free to expand in any former Soviet region that it wanted to, regardless of acknowledged independence of those countries, because none of the people that have acknowledged those countries are going to do anything to actually step in. So, if the presence of communist troops China, pro-Chinese communists in Vietnam was an existential threat to the United States, and you don't acknowledge that Ukraine is orders of magnitude more significant, then I don't know what to tell you. I just think that this is a existential crisis to our country, not only militarily, but once Europe goes, because it will go. If you don't think Ukraine is the first pin in a series of pins to be pulled in Europe, I don't know what to tell you. Russia, after Moldova will just give up. Moldova will not offer military resistance to the Ukraine.
To Russia.
The next two people on the list are either Georgia, right, to Russia. Sorry, it will either Moldova will fall to either Russian or Belarusian forces. Now, I have a feeling that Belarus is going to become a proxy for Russian dominance in the region. But following Moldova, it's either going to be Romania or Georgia. Those two countries are next on the pecking order after Moldova, and Moldova will not offer military resistance. They'll just agree to whatever Russia wants. The Ukrainian people remember 70 years ago ethnic cleansing. Their memory is there were people still alive during this crisis who remembers what the Russians did in World War II. And if they don't know themselves, they heard stories from their parents and grandparents. And they saw it with the Russian cleansing of the Tartars when they took Crimea. So, the Russians have a history of ethnic cleansing. And the Ukrainians know they're one of those ethnicities that aren't loved by Russians. And we can only see what the war crimes the Russians are perpetrating against the Ukrainian people now are the round one ethnic cleansings that they're going to do. Targeting of hospitals and civilian centers, whether or not you think that they're accidental casualties or, whether or not they're purposeful casualties, what's going on in Russia with the Russian military shows that there are elements of the Russian military that don't care about any civilian casualties, and it may be a way to engage in a certain amount of ethnic suppression of Ukrainians in order to weaken the morale of the people and or bolster Russian morale at the same time.
So here's what I'd like to do. A couple of quick things. First of all, I do think, and I think we've been talking about, I do think, unfortunately, it's hard to even say it, but I think that they are going to be leaning towards, it looks like they're trying to find an excuse to use chemical weapons. It looks like they already started with that when they were doing their false flags for attempting to do this invasion in the first place. That aside, we know they're well, we don't know, but we have unconfirmed reports. What strikes me as credible reports that they're dropping butterfly bombs along the evacuation corridors. So that's not an accident. So I think the jury has to really be in on the targeting of civilians by at least some members of the military, and certainly there doesn't seem to be an effort to stop that if it's not in fact under orders. So, we did have somebody. I'd like to look up this agreement. So I was about to look it up, but I had to do one other thing on the production side. But Sunday Warship says, quote, all it says is the signatories would, quote, seek immediate United Nations Security Council actions provided to assist Ukraine. If that's all it says, I remember the vaguest details. I've never even read it. But I know roughly what Pat's talking about, and we've discussed it briefly before. So, Pat, if you can take a minute, and I'll try to find it in a minute. Because I'd like to find that exact passage, and we can take a look at what it says. Just because it's that's okay. That's if that's what you're saying it says. Let's take a look. Pat's been on a lot, and he usually knows what he's talking about. So we'll find it and we'll take a look. But I do think, unfortunately,
the way that Security Council assurance was only in the event of nuclear weapons. We were actually, again, I'm doing this all from memory. We were required in the event of a nuclear exchange between Russia and an unarmed Ukraine to engage in retaliatory strikes, for lack of a better term. Both ourselves and the other signatories, and to seek UN approval for UN sanctions and actions against Russia in that event. The other issue is that we agreed in a non-nuclear capacity to ensure we agreed to ensure the sovereignty of Ukrainian territorial boundaries. Now that's where, I'll be honest, some people go, well, that doesn't mean military interventions, but in the talks of the period, that's what it meant. And if you want to, vacillate now, that just shows that, again, like many American pundits are doing, the language was very distinct. It was an assurance that Russia would, in the event of Russian aggression into the region, we had given assurances to our quote unquote allegiance or guarantee of assistance to Ukraine. In the context of 1994, this was military intervention, and that's how it was mentioned at the time.
Well, I got to be honest.
If you want to go back and say, well, that's not what we...
I got to be honest. That's what it would mean to me now. I mean, I'm not sure what if we sign a deal now that says we guarantee or we ensure or we give an assurance that this will not. The assurance doesn't really mean anything. I mean, an assurance means that we are putting the full weight of the United States behind. That's what an assurance is. It's to the best of my knowledge. So even today, that strikes me as meaning that the full weight of the U.S. is assuring this. If it's not, you have to put in that caveat because an assurance is an assurance. I could be wrong. I'm not a linguistic. I'd find it hard to interpret that any other way.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, part of the reason China and France wouldn't sign on to the accord was they took a more limited amount of what they'd be willing to do. I think they agreed to recognize the borders of an independent Ukraine, but I think I can't remember what it was, but it was a slightly less committed memorandum. Basically, it was a little softer. It gave them some outs, right? Ours didn't. England signed right on the dotted line with ourselves against quote unquote Russia. And this was hailed as one of the greatest nuclear non-proliferation agreements in history. I don't think people realize how. I still remember this. This was all over the news. Again, I think Clinton broke his arm several times, patting himself on the back. John Kerry was hailed as this great negotiator because this largely happened under him and the G7 at the time. But even again, I remember, I can't remember the guy's name, Sergey, I can't remember his last name. In 2016, there was a Russian person talked about
Lavrov.
Yeah, right. He made a comment that we never violated the agreement because it had nothing to do with Ukrainian nukes, but it was ignoring major provisions of the agreement, particularly around the boundaries. Yes, it talked about what we would do if a nuclear-armed Russia attacked a non-armed Ukraine, Belarus, and other countries. Basically, yeah, we'll launch nukes at you if you launch nukes at them. But there was the other issues regarding the guarantees of border integrity, and Russia seems to have largely ignored that. They said, "Hey, we didn't launch nukes at anybody, so we didn't break the agreement." But if you read the agreement, you don't have to have a law degree to figure that what it clearly says in plain language is Russia agrees to honor and not invade. We agree to honor to not invade because we couldn't invade these countries either. We couldn't occupy these countries. But Russian troops in Buda, and by the way, Russian troops in Belarus are a violation of this agreement. And Russian troops have been in Belarus for several years. So this just shows that that this agreement has no American resolve behind it.
So let's assume that the the document says what you remember it saying, and that there was an actual pledge of military force to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine. Let's say that the United States says, okay, well, we signed this, we signed this treaty with, and so we are now going to put the full weight of our military into Ukraine to repel specifically to repel the Russian forces.
Right.
And, obviously, we're going to give them, at least a little bit of notice to start removing their forces without further aggression as the United States starts moving in, because the full weight of the United States military is now going to come down on you. What do you think Russia does? I mean, they've already violated this agreement as well. They now have the United States directly threatening the Russian military. Putin has already said that he would declare war, or would consider it an act of war for NATO forces to become involved. What do you think the results of that is going to be?
Well, the first correction I'd make to your statement is don't use the word NATO in regards to Ukraine. If the U.S. is going to act, it necessarily follows the Budapest Agreement countries, not NATO countries. England, France, and the United States are the only signatories.
I understand that, but I understand that. But Putin has already stated that if any NATO member country directly attacks him, he will consider it an act of war, and he's going to. I mean, he's said that. So it's like I guess how much do you believe what Putin says?
Why are we worrying about what Putin says?
Because Putin's the one that is in charge and is the one that has his finger on nuclear weapons. That's why we should care about what he's saying.
I mean, if Putin, I mean, this is
what
the
happens.
Well, let's so just to clarify, I do think Pat brings up. So let's just if the U.S. in an obligation to the Budapest Agreement enters, that is the grounds on which we go in. Putin has made it clear he will see that as NATO interference, and will see that as an attack by NATO. So he will respond as if he's been attacked by NATO. So the question, I think, and at this point that I'd like to hear from Pat is, what happens next? I think is Andring's question. What happens at that point? Is that correct? Okay. So Pat, what do you think?
Yes, that's what I'm wondering is what happens after that.
We place, significant military assets into the country. I mean, if you want to give Putin notification that within a certain number of hours, 48, 72, whatever time frame you want to give them, that American troops will be entering the region along with French and English compatriots to order to restore Ukrainians' territorial boundaries, and that any Russian troops in those regions will be considered combatants. You are affirming a conventional conflict. At that point, if Russia, if Putin decides he wants to, I don't like this terminology, but he wants to double down on a nuclear conflict, then there's very little we can do as a country to mitigate that. Because what we're basically saying is that we're more afraid of Russia being nuclear. If Russia is willing to declare war against the United States today, when are we going to be willing to actually stop Russia? Are we going to stop Russia when it invades Europe? What happens when Russia invades Romania? What happens when Russia invades a NATO member? What happens when Russia invades Finland or Sweden, which they've already made, Putin's said similar things against Finland, quote unquote, keeping its nose out of European affairs, right? So when do you stand up against the bully? Because the bully has a baseball bat. This is ultimately, I mean, I hate to put it in schoolyard terms, but if you're worried about Putin in Ukraine because of what he might do in Ukraine, you need to worry what Putin will be doing until he's dead. Because if you embolden him here, he'll be more. Crimea was the first emboldening. and him becoming more emboldened. The next emboldenment will be Ukraine, followed by Ukraine, whatever else he wants to go. I'm not a big fan of the domino theory, but in this case with Putin, it's proven to be correct. The invasion of Georgia was a precursor to the invasion of Crimea. The invasion of Crimea is a precursor to the invasion of Ukraine. The soft political subjugation of the Belarusian government to Russia, even though there's an agreement not to do that and not to place Russian troops in Belarus, all these agreements have been violated. At what point do we say no more? I do think that many Americans are looking at Ukraine as a single point of Russian violation of territorial sovereignty. And I can think of at least 6 or 7 off the top of my hat in the last 40 years since agreements like this or that have come after it have been put in place. Again, if you only think about today in the last 5 years, yes, Russia, if you forget about Crimea, well, we forget about Crimea, we'll forget about other places, but hey, what is Russia? Well, Russia, this is the first time. Well, Russia's going to be able to keep pulling this. This is our first time. This is our first time. This is our first time because Americans have a 2-year memory cycle. And then Obama was a different president. Obama was incompetent in Crimea. My political agreement aside, Obama was more worried about bombing Yemenis with drones than he was about the sovereignty of the Crimean region. So for all those doves out there that think Obama was a great president, I'm sorry, he killed innocent Yemenis at the same time he was willing to throw Crimea down the proverbial shithole because he wasn't willing to actually honor America's agreements because he didn't want to look bad. He was more than willing to kill Yemenis with drones. And that's where we're at, is Americans are only good for about 2 or 3 news cycles, and they forget everything that's important in long-term strategic. If we would have held Putin at Crimea or Georgia, this would not be happening today. That's just it's a matter of fact, in my opinion.
All right.
Right.
So,
Freddie is the schoolhouse bully, though. We can't just say this. The bully has a bat. The bully's got about 14 tons of C4. But I take your point on what we should. At what point do we say, you cannot do this? My question is, what do you think Putin is going to do if we put the full force of the U.S. military and the along with the English and the French and whoever else we're obligated? What do you think Russia does?
He withdraws from the country.
You don't think he declares war or?
Sure,
he just backs away.
Well, if Russia declares war, I mean, I'm not a military analyst, but I know a few. Russia can't. I mean, in a conventional war, Russia can't win against us, particularly as long as we fight a limited war. If we're not going to topple the Russian government, we can win pretty much anything we go in against Russia on in a conventional purview.
I absolutely agree. If we decided we were going to use the full might of the United States military to secure all of Ukraine, including Crimea, I have absolutely zero doubts that we could do so, and we could do so in probably 72 hours.
Correct. I think the outlier is 14 days. We could expel all Russian forces from Crimea. I think I heard that from someone I respect their opinion on. Let's just say that's it. And if we make a very declarative statement, hey, this is, Russian forces found in Ukraine will be considered foreign belligerents, and, we'll take whatever military option necessary. Putin is either obstinate or foolish to think he can win, but I think Putin's a practical person. I don't think Putin everybody's talking about Putin being crazy and Putin being a megalomaniac. Well, that might be true.
But he's not insane. He's not unhinged. He's
Putin
practical. I agree.
Is about Putin. Yeah. Right. And I think if a very strong and united and again, I think this is where we need to act alone if no one else will join us. But America and or its allies say we're going to put 100,000 troops into Ukraine to, again, lend to the integrity of the Ukrainian border. And any Russian troops after a certain date and time will be found in country will be considered, foreign hostile soldiers. I think you see a quick demarcation into Russia. This is what's important too. Americans think that the Russian people are going to get news that the United States forced the Russians out of Crimea. Well, that'll be what our news services show. Whether or not it's reality, we can argue about that. But in Russia, the propaganda will be Putin leaves Crimea after agreeing to whatever, right? Putin will be the hero regardless how this turns out. And I think people forget that the propaganda in Russia will show Putin, regardless of what happens and whatever he does, comes out on top, and he will be presented in a positive light. There are American news agencies are promoting the unrest in Russia over this invasion, but what they're failing to show, which luckily foreign news services are showing, are the overwhelming number of Russians in support of the invasion of Ukraine because they're a very pro-Putin government. So for every protester, there are 2 to 3 very pro-Putin factions in the country. So the propaganda machine in Russia is very strong. The state news is very powerful there. We only have, fortunately, 1 or 2, state news services here for pro-Russian propaganda, whether or not it's OAN or Fox News. Unfortunately, we're able to deal with that. But the American people generally know that, it will require some blood, and it will require quite a bit of treasure to get the Russians out of Ukraine. But do we ethically, we owe it to the Ukrainians because we signed an agreement with them to do so. And morally, can we stand by while civilians are targeted, to whatever degree by Russian military assets? Again,
well, one of those questions I can answer, will we stand by while, atrocities are being committed? Absolutely. We've done it time and time and time again, when we probably shouldn't have. I'm not against you here. I'm asking what you think that looks like for the United States to actually commit a worthwhile effort.
My understanding of his position is that Putin will not engage because I agree with Pat very, very strongly on this, which is something I've said before. I honestly think Putin will fight to the death, absolutely, without hesitation. But he's not actually. I don't think he's vengeful or wrathful in that sense. I don't think he's if I can't have it, I'll nuke the world to get it. I think he'd be willing to nuke the world to get anything. Don't get me wrong. And I think he's not afraid of brinksmanship, and he will not lose under any set of circumstances. But I don't think he's got I think pragmatism is his number one charting, course here. So I think Pat's argument, if I understand correctly, is because he's aware that that a nuclear war will cost him everything he's trying to get. He's not going to do it. And since he's aware he cannot win a conventional war, he's going to withdraw. I think that's your position. Is that correct?
Right. No, that's correct. And basically, as long as U.S. military assets and other, member parties don't invade what is currently Russian territorial boundaries, I don't think Putin, even within his own political system, has there are other people besides Putin in the Russian government. I don't think Putin would have the support to declare war on Russia unless there are factions in his government that would not support him unless American military personnel and equipment entered clearly regions that are identified as Russian territorial space. So if we entered Crimea and Ukraine, I don't think Putin would have the support that many people think he would have.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure we could do it in 72 hours with nothing more than the Air Force and the Navy. The Navy can completely wipe out all of the Marine forces and take Crimea very quickly.
I agree.
and the Air Force can like literally surgically strike every single one of the military. I mean, they haven't been particularly stealthy where their military assets are. The Russian military assets are.
I think if we
take those out very quickly.
Zandering, I think if we just promised, if we agreed to fly, air support for Ukrainian forces, that would be enough to have Putin leave the country. If we agreed that we were going to ensure no-fly zones of Russian aircraft over Ukraine, and that any air-to-air defenses would be destroyed that were in Russian possession, we'd have an end to this conflict pretty fast. And if we agreed to actually use our Air Force in support of Ukrainian forces, Putin would be out of the country within 21 days.
All right.
It's really that. I
Yeah.
mean, it's simple. I'm just saying it's probably a reality.
Well, what I find interesting about that, because I've been thinking about that too, is and somebody had pointed out in the last show that Putin is using our fear of nuclear war against us, and it's a pretty effective weapon. But brinksmanship is in the Russian tradition. It's been that way for a very long time. And it's not in the American tradition, and it does give them serious leverage. We don't, for example, sit there and say, would Putin really be willing to do this? And we end up dismissing him as crazy, which he's just absolutely not. I wish he were. It would make, well, no, actually, I don't. Well, that depends, right? So let me rephrase that. If he were crazy, at a minimum, he may not be so effective. The reason he's so effective is because he's extremely intelligent, and he's still cognizant enough to be aware how to play us, how to play NATO, and so on and so forth. And while I truly believe the sanctions are having a far greater impact than he had anticipated, that A, doesn't mean that they're going to be sufficient, and B, doesn't mean that he's lost yet. It just means we're more competitive than we might otherwise have been. I did look up, and I have not read this agreement, and I would need to read it, read interpretations on it from both sides, and probably try to find an actual Ukrainian translation, because I think this may come down to a translation. But Volodymyr Vasulenko, who we've referenced a couple of times, and at the time in 2009, he had just come off of being the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK. He had prior been a Ukrainian ambassador to the EU, and he wrote an article in the Kiev Daily talking about the Budapest Memorandum, and what he says is that he is repeating apparently a claim that he's made repeated, and this is a Ukrainian ambassador, and what he says is that this does not guarantee the security of Ukraine, and that it's been misinterpreted by many Ukrainians to guarantee that security. He believes it should, but it doesn't, and he points out the following reasons. He says that what he's noticed is that it's non-binding, with the exception of only that exception that had been brought up in the live chat, of where the Ukraine can force and call the signatories to the UN under certain circumstances, and that's the only part that's binding. And he points out that the memorandum uses the term, quote, security assurances, which is far weaker than, quote, security guarantees. And he says because it's not guaranteed, the word assurance means that while this deal is helpful, it should not be relied on as something in fact, what's the phrasing he used? Something along the lines of it cannot be trusted to ensure Ukrainian safety because there's no guarantees and there is no. So at this point, 2009, he seems to think that this document does not guarantee Ukrainian safety, and that that it should not be interpreted that way. to his chagrin. He's not pleased about it, but that's the argument. And he says it's a good deal, but that Ukrainians need to build on that deal because it is insufficient explicitly because of the use of security assurances over the use of security guarantees, which in his view, as a former diplomat to the EU and UK, and I forget what he's been doing in this war effort, but his name's come up several times. In his view, this was not a guarantee.
Well, so I pulled up the document since I read it a couple weeks ago. So you can find it online. It's officially entitled Volume 3007 I-52241, Ukraine, Russian Federation, United Kingdom of Great Britain and North Ireland and the United States, Memorandum on the Security Assurances in Connection with Ukraine's Accession to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation Agreements, Budapest, December 5th, 1994. Section it lists all the signatories first, but and the purpose is the stated intent is welcome the accession of Ukraine to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation Agreement, working weapons as a non-nuclear weapon state, taking into account the commitment of Ukraine to eliminate all its nuclear weapons from its territory within a specific period of time, noting the change in the worldwide security situation, including the end of the Cold War, which have brought about conditions for deep reduction of nuclear forces. All signatories confirmed to the following. This is Part 1. The Russian Federation, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the CSCE Final Act. That's another treaty which you need to read, but that actually talks about territorial integrity in former Soviet states, and to respect the independence and sovereignties of the existing borders of Ukraine. Part 2, the Russian Federation and United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, and the United States of America reaffirm their obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. It is a complete non-aggression pact on behalf of all signatories. 3, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the CSCE Final Act to refrain from economic coercion designed to subordinate their own interests, the exercise of Ukraine, the rights inherent to its sovereignty, and thus secure advantage of any kind. Part 4, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of North Ireland, the United States of America reaffirm their commitment to seek immediate United Nations Security Council action to provide assistance to Ukraine as a non-nuclear weapons state party to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of the United States if Ukraine should become the victim of an act of aggression or an act of threat of aggression in which nuclear weapons are used. So that's the nuclear weapon part.
Yeah.
But this is the Part 5. I think people are missing this. The Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America reaffirm, in the case of Ukraine, their commitment not to use any nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear weapon state party to the party of non-proliferation, except in the case of an attack upon themselves, their territories, independent nations, armed forces, or the allies of such states in association with the alliance of nuclear weapons. And then Part 6 is Ukraine, the parties will consult in the event of situation arises when questions concerning these commitments. Now, the CFRE is about conventional military engagement. So they're referring to another act, which this was only talking about nuclear weapons and economic and political interests, but without knowing what the CSCE is, you don't understand what this memorandum actually is in its entirety. They're referring to that only because that's talking more about limited military, like what we call conventional warfare today, and independence. And again,
so yeah, I'm just finding a couple of because. Yeah, I'm so just in regards to what the comment that had been made in the live chat. I think he missed because I think he's the only assurance that I can find was actually that nuclear part. The rest, even the a former ambassador from the Ukraine to the UK and the EU has said that this was not a guarantee and that it was in fact weaker than a guarantee. And I've also found from I think it was 3 weeks after the signing, a clarification. So, January 11th, 1994, U.S. official asked whether the Budapest Agreement, at the time called the Trilateral Agreement, meant the United States would go to war if Ukraine was invaded. Quote, so these are security assurances, and those assurances are consistent with our obligation within those two treaties. There are no new guarantees or obligations on the part of this agreement. So if there's another treaty that would obligate us, then it seems like, well, at least what was said at the time would be concordant with that. But this claim is that this Budapest Agreement did not actually, while it was an assurance within our current obligations, it, quote, was not a new guarantee or obligation, at least as a part of the Budapest Agreement.
Well, I agree, but then we have to go to the earlier cited agreement, which had been enacted, I think, in 1992. I'm going to have to look again. I've read them both, but this had to do with.
Yeah, but I'm just so that's my concern. My concern, and again, I haven't read either, but from what I found, there was, at least at the time, and from January, I think it was 11th, 94, through the ambassador in 11, who said that this did not constitute a guarantee, and that was an explicit concern of his, saying that it had to be built upon because it was not a guarantee. It seems to me that there were some reasonable interpretations at the time that this was not a guarantee. If there were previous guarantees, maybe, but that the Budapest Agreement alone did not do that. Is what I'm reading. Again, not an expert, and I'm doing this sort of on the fly based on a comment there.
To be fair, at the same time, there are other people that interpreted the Budapest Agreement as being a firm commitment. I mean, that the fact that there were ambiguities, I agree, and I think I acknowledged that at the beginning of our conversation. But the general belief on behalf of the Ukrainians was that the 94 agreement, in conjunction with other things they had agreed to, was a guarantee of their sovereignty.
I have to believe it. If I was in Ukraine, I would not have signed this unless that was my belief. I have to believe that, because you're not going to give up your only shield, knowing that Russia could come after you. So I have to believe that was the people who were signing it reasonably, unless I'm missing something. I have to believe that was their interpretation. But I'm just trying to look at both sides. It looks like there are credible actors, not just outside actors, but credible actors who aren't necessarily far right, and including even credible actors in the Ukrainian government before this invasion happened, saying that this is not a guarantee. So that's my only. But listen, it's getting to be about 11:45, and I don't want to just end this. So I'm not saying that we're ending it, but I'm shooting for about a 20-minute wrap up, just to let everybody know. So I have closed the outside line. If anybody wants to come in briefly, although I'm actually thinking we probably won't bring anyone else in because it may derail, and I want to just sort of wrap this up. I want to see if Azandring has anything else to add, and I want to make sure. So if 20 minutes sounds good to you guys, just because it's getting a little late. I think it's been a very worthwhile conversation, and I think this is this is what we do. So I'm immensely pleased to be having this discussion. So thank you very much, Pat, for coming on. So I don't know, Pat, not Pat. Azandring, did you have anything else you wanted to contribute before we pass it back to Pat, or just see where we're going to go for the next 15, 20 minutes?
About the only thing that I can think of is, and I've said it before, is the United States needs to decide whether it wants to be an interventionist country or if it's going to be an isolationist country. Are we going to intervene in areas where things like, massive humanitarian crises are being inflicted on other civilians, or are we going to sit back and say, nope, not our problem, not our circus, not our monkeys, you guys deal with it, or are we going to say this isn't right? and we're willing to stand up and say this isn't right, and we're going to stop it.
Out of curiosity,
right now, I'm thinking.
Yeah, please finish. I was going to ask that, but you can fold this into your answer. But I mean, where do you lean, or do you have a specific? Do you lean, or have you completely just? What are your thoughts on what America should decide on that? But please finish your thought and then answer that one.
So I was just going to say that it seems that the U.S. is more or less siding on we're not really going to get involved in things anymore. As far as what should we do, there are definite advantages to the United States essentially being the world's police force and stepping in when things like this happen. One, we have the ability to stop, like we could end the conflict in Ukraine, at least, fairly quickly. But that comes with, costs, and do the United States want to bear the costs? It comes with a lot of benefits too. For the world's police force, we get to kind of dictate how a lot of lesser countries, I hate to say lesser countries, less powerful countries are going to interact with us or interact with our allies. And that's one of the reasons, as I understand it, I've just started getting into more foreign policy type things because that was one area that I'm lacking in. But that was one of the goals of the very aggressive, we're kind of the world's police foreign policy is that we could get better agreements and better deals for the United States that benefit us here. But then that kind of turned a little bit sour because it seemed like we were twisting, not being such a great country or being viewed as a very great country because we did some pretty shady shit. But we've got to decide whether we're going to do that or not, and depending upon exactly what that previous treaty or agreement actually says about conventional warfare, it's like I didn't see anything in there with the nuclear treaty that was signed that doesn't appear to obligate the United States to do anything unless nuclear weapons were used against Ukraine. So I'm not sure. It's like there's a lot of things Russia can do that would really screw with life in America that doesn't involve weapons at all. So I just have to wonder, do we have the resolve to actually stand up and say, hey, we're not letting this shit fly anymore, and we are going to be kind of the world's policemen, or aren't we? And it's trying to split the baby here which we seem to be doing a lot. Our COVID response seems to be 50-50, and it just seems like we want our cake and we want to eat it at the same time. It's like you don't really get to do both at the same time. So pick one.
I think the biggest failing is a failure to understand the importance of soft power. And as we've been saying, we're not going to be the world's police anymore. China has deliberately been expanding their soft power, and it's going to mean a lot to them. And I think for Americans, a failure to understand nuance, a failure to understand investing in the rest of the world and investing in a stable rest of the world yields most benefits for the people at the top. Most benefits for the people at the top. And we have to be very careful that we don't abuse it. And we do abuse it because everybody abuses power when they have it for long enough. But if we don't try to keep that in check, then we're going to do what we're doing now, which is the world starts to really hate us. And I think a lot of times people have said, well, the world really hates the fact that the U.S. thinks of themselves as the world's police. Well, I think they did resent it, but it wasn't until maybe the last 20 years or so, a little less than that, I think, that they've really started to despise it. But when we first came in for the first Gulf War, they were thrilled, and we won a lot of points doing that. And we won a lot of points by the way, leaving when before going in and finishing off Saddam Hussein and saying, no, we're just going to liberate. And there was a reason, and that built up a lot of goodwill. And even though countries, nothing breeds hatred like success. And the U.S. was was disliked for a lot of reasons. That's just like, okay, fine. But now it's like we've broken so many of our promises, and we've taken such advantage of that power. And I think Abu Ghraib is a spectacular example of not just that it happened, but then hiding it and saying that, like, we can't talk about it because it empowers our enemies. No, being cowards empowers our enemies. And when we refuse to be open and honest about what we did, we're saying that we think we should be treated, differently. And if we're not going to pay the price, by the way, too, because you talk a lot about moral hazard, if we're not going to pay the price, what we're trying to do is then we're trying to blame news media for the price that we'd have to pay for committing that crime. And it's sort of like, no. And like, well, yeah, it is going to offer a incentive to go attack American troops. It's going to empower our enemies talking about this. But that's why we shouldn't have done it in the first place. You don't blame the whistleblower. You blame the people doing it in the first place. And the reason more Americans were being killed was because we tolerated that, and we really thought that that kind of thing was okay. So we have to fix ourselves, not shout at the whistleblowers. And that was, for me, when people started saying that the media was the problem because they were empowering the enemy by making that public. It's like, oh no, if we're not willing to admit where the real fault is there, we are in very big trouble. And I think you're right, and I think I think we've lost sight of what the benefits were, and there were a lot of costs, and you have Americans dying in foreign wars, but the reality too is when you have a more stable planet, it helps most. Most countries in Africa don't really care about the stability of Europe. Other than how it affects what food they do get. Most of this shit doesn't affect them. But instability in Iraq, instability in Kuwait, that affects us more than anybody. And if we can go in and I don't know, I'm preaching, I apologize. Soft power is important, and we've forgotten that because it's nuance.
Yeah. It is important if you want a stabilized world. I mean, the people are talking about kind of especially with the many of the European countries deciding, oh, maybe we should spend a little bit more on our military and defense spending. A lot of people have been worried about a return to spheres of influence versus essentially having the United States be one of the largest militaries on Earth. I mean, it's like there's a reason that the United States spends more than every other country combined on its military, and it was because it needed to be able to respond anywhere in the world within 48 hours with overwhelming force, and that costs a hell of a lot of money, and you need a lot of equipment. That's why we maintain so many bases around the world. I mean, that's a real cost of being the world's policeman. And if you're not willing to foot that kind of cost for a military that's more powerful than all of the other militaries combined, then you're not willing to be the world's police. And we did gain a hell of a lot of benefits. One of those benefits was being the world reserve currency. So
I'm hearing a lot of noise coming in that may be on Pat. Hold on, I'm hearing a lot of noise coming in. I think that may be from Pat's microphone. Oh, okay, it's gone. So you were saying one of the benefits that we got from being the world's police was becoming the world's reserve currency. Is that correct?
Yeah, because the United States came out of mostly going into the 70s, we were the most powerful nation on Earth. The only thing that threatened us was the USSR. And, then come around the 80s, we really started bankrupting the USSR. Granted, it cost us a lot of money to do that. It eventually worked, but we never, really paid that off. It just kind of spiraled into let's spend more and more and more. But it's like you have to recognize that these things come with costs, and you have to be willing to bear the costs and actually take the responsibility and then commit to it. And it seems like we go in the people's opinion goes in waves, and then of course when things start getting coming to light that there's been some corruption here, which is as you point out is inevitably going to happen. The question is are you going to stop say, oh yeah, that was really bad, we shouldn't have let that happen, and let's fix it, versus trying to sweep it under the rug and then yell at the people who were saying, hey, that's a problem. So, there was a weaker America, one that doesn't actually stand up and say, no, we're going to be the world superpower, and we're going to make sure that these atrocities don't happen, is definitely a safer world. I mean, I think we have pretty good evidence to support that the world is a safer place when the United States does that. The question is since generally speaking, we're not going to be threatened very much. I mean, we've got pretty friendly countries to the north and south, huge oceans to the east and west. Russia isn't going to attack us in a conventional war, and pretty much nobody else is either, at least us personally, our homeland. So other people around the world are going to suffer. That has ripple effects, which are going to cause, issues in the United States as well. I mean, it's not we're going to get off scot-free. There will be pain, economic pain, usually. But yeah, we've got to decide. And I don't think, it's kind of like we're getting the worst of all worlds, because we're kind of there and we're not there. So we're still getting yelled at because we have the largest military in the world. We're still being blamed for throwing our military might around and our economic might around, and yet we're not stopping any of these atrocities either. So kind of like my bitch about our COVID, it's like either care about the economy and tell people, hey, this isn't a particularly dangerous virus, go back to work, or you say, no, this is a virus that we really need to pay attention to, and we need to take serious steps and commit to those steps. When you try and do it both ways, you just end up with a crappy outcome. So pick one and go with it.
Yeah, that's the U.S. motto, though. We'll split the difference and come up with a crappy. We'll make sure everybody is equally dissatisfied. All right, so Pat, any thoughts? There's a lot there. Would absolutely love to hear your thoughts. I'm gonna mute myself for just 1 minute, but please hit us. I'll still be able to hear you. So please give us your thoughts.
Well, before anybody wants to talk about the Budapest Accords, I really think they should go back and read the CSCEs. I guess when they were signed in 1975 in Helsinki. Actually, that reminds me. They're also known as Helsinki Accords for those that want to find them. Read through that document first, and then read the Budapest Agreement regarding the admission of Ukraine as a country that will be acknowledged within that agreement, and then decide whether or not U.S. involvement in Ukraine based on this 1975 and then subsequent 1994 agreement is appropriate. Because I don't think, put your politics aside and just say, hey, if they had this document first, now they have this document second. What do these two documents actually say? And I think anybody who wants to read, you can read it any way you want, but if you try to be neutral, you'll agree that the reason the Ukrainians agreed for, complete disarmament of their nuclear arsenal was because by reading these two documents, it was at least generally accepted that Europe and the United States would aid them in the event that their military boundaries were violated, their territorial boundaries. As long as they weren't the aggressor, they could rely upon European intervention in the support of the independence of their country against an actor. And most of these documents, it specifically states Russia, but and any other actor in the region. So I would just ask people to read this stuff before they go off half-cocked and start saying we have no reason to go there and we never made any promises or any agreements to the contrary.
Well, and I have to say, if I loved my country, I would not sign that document without believing that that's what it meant.
Well, I mean, like the CSCE, again, I think, I know some people refer to them as the Helsinki Accords, but I don't know if that's actually right. It's the Helsinki Act, I think. I mean, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's either 50 or 60 pages long. So, I mean, it takes some time to read it and understand what it's saying. It's everything from military conflict to human rights.
No, hold on, I'm switching over the mic here. So No, I think that's. I mean, people we've brought it up and discussed it once or twice already, and I think it's worth understanding a lot better. So I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. It was absolutely worth. I think this was a great conversation on it. So thank you very much for coming in. So I definitely think we're going to start to wrap it up because it's getting a little late. We haven't really been paying too much attention to the live chat, and I apologize for that. But it looks like a lot of people have been having sort of their own discussions, and I've seen myself tagged in one or two questions, but I do see Blaster Master made one question, and I think it's worth getting to, and it was one that I'd wanted to ask earlier anyway, so I think it works out. So it says, okay, it feels like we already screwed the pooch here. Well, at this point, what can't he do? I mean, if we're not going to act at this point, he can do anything he wants to. So, and then to Pat's larger point, and if he's sort of undermining, at a minimum, U.S. credibility going forward, that we're going to honor any of our agreements. If he is splitting NATO, which we made an argument as to why he could actually be forcing a split in NATO, and where some of the countries may, instead of honoring Section 5, might decide to leave. All that notwithstanding, okay, we are here now. Practically speaking, what do you think there is will to do going forward, and what's the resolution to this? Are we just going to hobble along with sanctions, and he's going to keep attacking until either the Crimean, wow, I'm definitely a little tired, the Ukrainian people give out? I don't think they're going to quit. I think they're going to continue until they're completely wiped out. So either they fold completely, or the sanctions either work and there's some kind of revolution. I don't see any other solution. So let's start with 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐸. What are your thoughts on that? And then I'd like to hear Pat on just like practically speaking, at this point, the U.S. isn't going to honor this agreement, and we're trying to find a solution. Is there one? Can anyone make a prediction as to what it might be? So let's start with you, 𝐂𝐚𝐥𝐸, and then we'll go to Pat, and then I think we'll wrap it up.
I don't think the United States is going to involve itself militarily in Ukraine. They may do some behind the barn stuff to try and help, but they're certainly not going to do so very publicly, and I certainly don't think we're going to have our military involved in any way. I think that we're going to leave it up to places like Germany and the rest of Europe to figure essentially say, figure your shit out. We may offer more support to places like Poland or Germany so that they can offer support. But I have a feeling that if this invasion is to be stopped, either Putin gets taken out, there's some sort of regime change in Russia that puts an end to this, or there's going to be unaligned countries are going to, and even some of the other NATO countries are going to offer support, and they're going to get involved, and they're going to stop the invasion. But I don't see the U.S. playing a very big or prominent role, at least on the world stage, in this.
All right, Pat, if
I have no confidence. I have no confidence that this administration has any will whatsoever to have a military solution in any way, shape, or form.
All right. What I'm going to do here is some people have been asking for those documents. I don't know if you have them handy, Pat. What I'm going to do is I've got you here. I have modded you, so I haven't modded you yet. I'm in the process of modding you. Hold on a sec. You are now modded, which means that you, Pat, can drop those links in the Discord. So we're just going to mod you just for this show. We try not to do courtesy wrenches on this channel. We don't do courtesy wrenches on this channel. So you're modded. If you've got those, great, drop them. If not, you can give them to me whenever you've got them convenient, and I will make sure that they end up in the description. In fact, I'll put them in the description either way. Because I think those are important documents. So any documents that we've referenced tonight that you have access to, feel free to drop in the live chat right now, and or please make sure I get a copy, and I will put them in the description because I think people should be reading those. We also have a $5 super chat from Ian Davenport, who it's a sticker, always gives us a sticker at the end of these shows, and I really appreciate it. We get demonetized on at least 50% of our shows, as everybody knows by now, so your support is greatly appreciated. I don't know if Pat is willing to maybe head into the Discord afterwards and chat a bit. I won't be able to. It's getting late, and I have an early day tomorrow. But if we didn't do this tonight, we wouldn't have gotten to do it for the rest of the week. This is the only shot we had, so I'm really glad we did the overtime. But come join us on the Discord. You'll be able to talk to me, other people. We have discussions almost every day on the VC, and all of the news is being curated on news channels and discussions on Ukraine, philosophy, gaming, anything you want to. Come join us on the Discord, and link is in the description. And maybe, Jake, if you get a chance, if Titan isn't here, if you could drop that link. And then come join us, hang out. Also, like and subscribe. It really helps the channel because it boosts us in the algorithm, and that's something that that's why every YouTuber asks for it. Hate asking for it, but please do that. So we will get those to you guys. They'll either be in the description. Hopefully, by the time you're seeing this, if you're seeing this after the fact, you will see it in the description below. And or if Pat gets a chance, he's if Pat gets a chance, he'll drop that in the live chat, and I'll put it in the description. So, Pat, any thoughts on? So we've now ignored a obligation that at an absolute minimum, Ukraine believed we had to them, and that's that they have a credible argument to that. They would not have given up those weapons if they didn't believe that they had a security guarantee. We've ignored it. We aren't. What are we going to do now? What do you think is what do we have the will for, if anything? It looks like we barely have the will to pay more gasoline. We do appear to have it for now, but what are we going to do? What's going to happen?
Well, first of all, I will download those documents and get them into you immediately following the conclusion of this episode. I actually have them on my laptop, so I can download them and give you as PDFs. Second, I don't know what I would like to see America do, and I think I've been pretty vocal about that. Again, 100,000 U.S. military personnel inside Ukraine to stabilize the country, and if Russian forces aren't willing to egress out of the country, then to engage them and to launch devastating military counterattacks against Russian forces. I always like to remind people, I took a survey of a class probably 2 or 3 years ago, talking about European history, and only about 5% of my class actually knew the answer to this question. Most people, if you ask them in World War II, what countries invaded Poland, everyone gets Germany. But about only 1 in 20 people realize that Russia was the secondary aggressor in the conquest of Poland. Poland was invaded by Russia about 20 days. Some people argue it's 19, but on September 17th, 1939, Soviet forces invaded Poland, and they took 2/3 of the country, not 1/3 like Germany did. They were the hammer that destroyed Polish resistance against the German occupation of their country. Now, it's been a long time since 1939, but it does go to show that American understanding of history is often conflated with popular media and a very revisionist approach to understanding what goes on in the world. Where, again, I'm going to stop, but I'll talk about it in the Discord. But if you don't understand that the reason Poland fell to Germany, Poland didn't fall to Germany. Poland fell to the Russians. 2/3 of the Polish military was still fighting until the Russian invasion of the country. Yes, Germany attacked, but and bloodied the Polish military very badly. But it was the Russian military that defeated Poland. How much longer Poland would have held out against Germany, we don't know. And it's very similar today what's going on in Ukraine. Russia will continue to be an aggressor until they're stopped. And if they're not stopped, they will they will take Ukraine, and there will never be any attempt to give Ukrainian people independence again. It will effectively become another Russian satellite, and we'll have to live with a new world reality that every time someone is attacked by Russia, America will sit on its hands until they're on American soil. And if that's the America you want to live in, then we just have to, resolve ourselves to that. And, we're a democracy, so we'll decide collectively. That's it.
I will say this. So there was a comment. This guy's insane. I completely agree. That's why he belongs on this show. I've got to say, one of the things I love about End Time is trying to challenge those kinds of to get a much better understanding of history and how we got to where we are, and figuring out how to move forward. And to get behind what has, for especially Americans, it's an educational show, and part of that means we have to get beyond just what you see. So, always welcome Pat's contributions, because he really knows his shit. So, which isn't to say you're not gonna engage on it, but very few guests we've had on that really can compete with him in terms of his understanding of this sort of shit. So we're always glad when Pat comes on. Thank you, Pat, for joining us. Xandring, good to see you, and thank you so much for coming on as well and assisting. We're gonna try to get back to our regularly scheduled Tuesday shows. At least we'll still be covering this as needed. Probably, I think right now we're going to every other day on Ukraine. It's every day is just like, here's some more examples of things getting worse, which we know. So we're going to continue to cover it, and we'll cover it sort of as needed. Right now, it looks like it's going to be every other day, barring any breaking news, and that could happen at any time. So we're going to stay on that. Come to the Discord, and you'll see how we put this together and how we make decisions about when to go live, and you get to participate in that. This is actually, in many ways, a community-driven show. We are looking at having Dr. John 𝐓𝐢𝐬 to come on, and we're going to take another stab at philosophy of science. Dr. John 𝐓𝐢𝐬 is a Rutgers professor of philosophy, and we're gonna take a look at that. And we've got a couple other good shows planned coming up, so we're looking forward to that. Thank you so much for joining us for After Dark again. It's really great to be able to have people come on in and hang out. So thank you all for joining us. And I don't know, unless I missed something, we have comments in the below. We'll get to them if anyone has any comments. But thank you again, Pat, for joining us. Thank you, Xandring. Thank you to the mods who've been done 2 shows tonight. So you guys have been putting in double duty. It's around midnight where I am, but it was well worth it. And I'm glad we had this discussion. So thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of days, I'm sure. Have a good night, all.